To A.P.E.X, and it is my pleasure today to introduce you to our guest speaker, David Anthony Durham. So, David Anthony Durham is the author of a trilogy of fantasy novels set in Acacia, The Sacred Band, The Other Lands, and The War with the Maine, as well as the historical novels The Risen, Pride of Carthage, Walk Through Darkness, and Gabriel's Story. His first fantasy novel for children, The Shadow Prince, was published in 2021. He's won the Astounding Award for Best New Writer of Science Fiction, a Legacy Award from the Zora Neale Hurston Wright Foundation, was a finalist for the Prix Imaginales in France, and has twice had his books named New York Times Notable Books of the Year. His novels have been published in the UK and in French, German, Italian, Polish, Portuguese, Romanian, Russian, Spanish, and Swedish. He also writes in the Weird and Wonderful Wild Cards collaborative universe, which is edited by George R.R. Martin. His stories appear in Fort Freak, Lowball, High Stakes, Texas Hold'em, with another in Pairing Up. Other short fiction has been anthologized in Unfettered 3, Unbound, Unfettered, It's All Love, and In Gumbo, a celebration of African American writing. 4 of his novels have been optioned for development as feature films, and he has been a screenwriter consultant on several TV shows. He's currently on the faculty of the Stonecoast MFA Program of the University of Southern Maine and the MFA Program of the University of Nevada, Reno. And I had the very good pleasure of working with David as a student at the University of Southern Maine as part of the Stonecoast program. As a writer in genre fiction, I found his insights really valuable, and I think one thing to always remember, especially kind of living through the current moment and beyond, is that sometimes one of the most valuable things we can do, especially when dealing with the pandemic and all these other issues, is to find ways and find, apertures for imagining new worlds and thinking about things differently. And I think speculative fiction, I think genre fiction more generally, is really well suited to imagining new worlds. And David is one of the best imaginers of worlds that I know, so it is my very good pleasure to welcome to you all today, David Anthony Durham.
Okay, well, welcome to both of you. Welcome to Cedar City, David. But you're no stranger to Utah. You've been here several times.
I have, yes. I mean, I've driven through quite a number of times, but also spent some time in Zion and Moab and on the west water of the Colorado, kayaking. So, yeah.
And you even teach kayaking, right?
It's been a little while, but I did, yeah. For a long time, I was an outdoor educator and raft guide, and outward bound instructor, kayak instructor. Yeah, it was a big part of my life. I wish it was still more a part of my life.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Christopher, for kind of helping me to come here, and it's an honor. Thank you all for being here as well. Also, it's intimidating because that list of, the visuals there, the folks who've been in this series is kind of amazing. And then you get this lovely introduction, and then it's just me. So,
Well, we're thrilled. I have tons of questions to ask you. I mean, and I guess I'd love to start with asking Christopher a question. So, as you came to know David's work, you sort of mentioned how he imagines world. I was wondering, what struck you, what struck you about his writing? If you could maybe talk about that a little bit, and then we'll get into how David got into writing and all of that.
Okay.
Sure. Well, I don't know if this is going to be a very satisfying answer, but I think one thing that I appreciate about well, any piece of good fantasy fiction, especially, is just being able to be immersed in it, because you're kind of going in at a disadvantage, right? Because this is like, kind of unfamiliar territory. So one thing that I think you do well, David, is providing the details to make something feel authentic and lived in, that I can immerse myself in it in a way that it doesn't feel like, like if I'm, say reading Lewis Carroll, and it takes a lot of mental leaps, right, to get engaged with it. So, and I think your work does share, we mentioned George R.R. Martin in the intro, it does kind of share that same feeling of a lived-in world. And so I might have some questions later about how that ties in with what you've done with the historical fiction as well. So,
cool. Well, thank you for that. I mean, let's start with that, and maybe this will be a kind of an organic conversation, but this idea of, world creating, right? And then a lived-in world. Like, is that an intentional decision, or is it just how you see your worlds?
It is intentional, sure. And mentioning George is interesting, because when I wrote Acacia, the first Acacia book, that was novel number 3, and I was returning to fantasy after having been a fantasy reader as a kid, but then not really doing it, engaging with it as an adult, and it kind of just came back into my life. And I wrote Acacia without reading Game of Thrones. Kind of wish I had, because I thought I was like doing all this cool stuff, like a diverse world, a world that has represents our real world ethnicity and the diversity of cultures. That's instead of it being elves and dwarves and stuff, it's a world more like ours, which he did. And then I kind of realized that when I was like, okay, I should probably read this guy because he's doing amazing work. And but the book was already written. But I think we approach creating fantasy in very similar ways, because he is a lover of historical fiction as well, and that's where I began. And it always felt important to me that if I'm making an imagined world, it feel to me, and hopefully to readers, as grounded and real, and there be a long history of things in place that I understand, politics and cultural things that have shaped the world, and in many ways, I'd written Pride of Carthage about Hannibal and his war with Rome as novel. That was novel number 3. Acacia was number 4. And that really was a learning experience, because I had this whole epic story to tell, but there was a template of historical events that really helped with that. And that process and the research involved in that was extensive, but so too was making up an imagined world. Basically, I approached it the same way, as I'm convincing myself that this place has this long history, and there are these old issues that people have from different groups, and old crimes and lies, and a certain amount of mythologizing people's cultures, and that was the approach. I think it really came out of what I learned as a historical writer.
Cool. Well, that sort of touches on maybe some of the things that Christopher wanted to get into. And do you have questions that you'd like to get into about that historical fiction, fantasy, I don't know, overlap, I guess, or process?
Sure. I think one thing I'm interested in just thinking with librarian brain is just the research process and how you approach them differently, or maybe how you approach them the same in terms of doing the research for a historical fiction novel versus doing one for a fantasy trilogy. Yeah.
A question that comes up so frequently, I wish that I developed a better answer for it at this point in time. I really kind of approach them both very similarly, and it feels the same to me, the process. But the process is really a hodgepodge. So yes, there's reading lots of historical books about Hannibal, about the Punic Wars, about Rome and the ancient Mediterranean and all the stuff that seems like that's a good thing to be well versed in. But then there's also a lot of reading of fiction set in similar worlds, similar time periods, fiction that's not in the same time period, but in one way or another has resonance to things I should think about and consider in creating my world. And also, I was lucky enough to be living in Scotland when I wrote Pride of Carthage. So getting to Europe was, well, from there to the continent was a lot easier. And it was really important and a learning experience to be on the ground in Spain and France and Italy, driving around, just kind of absorbing the landscape, which has changed, and yet there were aspects of just being there and that really informed the way I approached the story, including that one might think, okay, it's so I went to Sagunto, is a town in Spain that was Saguntum, which was one of the cities that Hannibal sieged at the beginning of the novel and as the Second Punic War was starting. And you kind of think, okay, I'll go there and I'll see it. You know, I'll see this old city, and I'll that will be what I can base my version of things on. Get there though and realize that that was like more than 2,000 years ago. Well, things have changed. There have been people living in that space for all those years, and it's been built upon. It's not what it was before, and in a way that makes it feel like if you're looking back far enough in real world history, it's like you're looking into another world. Huh. It's not there, and you can take as much inspiration and from the actual historical record and the facts as you can observe them, but also, I think to your point earlier, you have to make a lot of stuff up. You have to imagine it in depth in a way that I think first I want it to make sense to me, but that's part of making it make sense to readers as well. So that was really freeing. On one hand, it's like, yes, I'm so glad to be here enjoying the sun in Spain. On the other hand, it freed me up to go, you know what? I can't describe what the city looks like because it's not there anymore. So I have to make it up and envision what's in my mind, and that's what gets on the page.
So staying with Pride of Carthage for a minute, where did that initial idea come from? Is that historical period always been something interesting to you? Did you get drawn to Hannibal and the conquest? I mean, where did that come from?
It came from a particular lecture in a Roman world class when I was an undergrad. I very much liked, I was a history major for a while, and definitely was attracted to the ancient world and the classical world. And in this class, it was just a big auditorium type situation. I was way up at the top. But that lecture about Hannibal and this war and the crazy twists and turns of fate that played out in that battle with Rome was, I kind of couldn't believe it. And so if people know anything about Hannibal, it's likely to be going across the Alps in winter with elephants. He did that.
Yeah.
It's pretty crazy. But there were so many other moments like that where it's like, this is like Shakespearean in a lot of the personal stories, the tragedies and triumph of his family, the way he essentially was so good at the things that he did that it took Rome quite a few years to figure out how to fight him, and that changed the life and destiny of Rome as well. Anyway, it just all felt kind of amazing, and I sat up at in the bleachers, kind of thinking, I want to read that novel, like a really good novel about this, and I guess I felt like I hadn't read that novel. And then 15 years or so later, I proposed it to my publisher, and surprisingly, they said yes. Surprisingly, because I didn't have any record of knowing how to write about ancient warfare and the brutal deaths of tens of thousands, but they said, yeah, try that. And they paid me some money for it, so then I had to do it.
That's always good.
It's
Well,
yeah.
I think that's a great inspiration for our students because, you know, it's that sort of exercising your imagination when you're in a class of any kind, you know, and letting the things that you're being told or that are being shared with you sort of tickle something in there. Would you say that's something that was always a part of who you are, or is that something that developed as you matured? I mean, did you always have a super active imagination?
Yeah, I guess I would say I did. And maybe one of the earliest examples of that was my love of D&D when Dungeons and Dragons, and the fact that in my friend group, I was always the dungeon master, which I kind of cheated at, because a lot of it was that I was reading a bunch of fantasy as a young reader. It is where I learned to read. I was a reluctant reader in the first place, and it was The Hobbit and C.S. Lewis and Ursula K. Le Guin, Lloyd Alexander, who taught me to love reading and stories and jumping into imagined worlds. And I read a bunch of other stuff that my friends didn't read, so then I could steal from that. And they thought I was creating these amazing D&D, kind of impromptu worlds. But yeah, a lot of it was kind of stolen. So there was that. And then I'm very aware that I used to get stories in my head about one thing or another, and it would live there for a little while, and then it would fade away, and I'd move on, and there'd be a different story that would take over. And it was an important step when I began to go, you know what, instead of letting those appear, percolate, and take over my mind for a little while, and then fade away, how about if I put them down on the page and see what I can make of them, and see if they can be things that don't fade away, but that have a life that is kind of tangibly there. Cool. Yeah.
Well, Christopher, I'll give you a second to kind of think of where you'd like to go next, but I would love to hear some, and I know we have shadow prints up here. So you mentioned sort of having this, maybe being a reluctant reader as a child, but then getting into fantasy and reading a lot of it. And Shadow Prince is your newest book.
Yes.
And it was just released, and it is a young adult, or it has a young adult slant. Tell us about it.
It's middle grade. Okay. So young adult is kind of more teen, and middle grade is a weird, kind of large category that is from kind of halfway through elementary school into middle school, but it's younger than young adult. But for example, it can include the likes of Harry Potter in it. So, and it's a genre that there's enough fun storytelling in it that it appeals to older readers as well. And for me, I was reading a lot of middle grade to my kids as they grew up. Yeah. And so there's that thing, before they can actually read it themselves, the stories are such that we could read those to them, and then it cycles into when they become avid readers themselves, and then yeah, it felt like a place to finally go back to, because it is where it all began for me. So.
For anyone who doesn't know what Shadow Prince is about, and yeah, I'll let you get a chance to kind of get that up and running. Maybe you could share a little bit of what the basic plot structure is.
I should do that. And the Shadow Prince, okay, I'll tell you where it began. It began, we talked about this at dinner last night, but anyway, some of you weren't there, so I'll say it again. It was one hot summer day in Massachusetts, Western Mass, where I lived at the time, and I just mowed the grass and came inside. There was no one home, and kind of sat down with a big glass of water and to cool off. But my son had borrowed a book about ancient Egypt from a neighbor, and I just picked that up and began flipping through it. And for whatever reason, on that particular day, I was really, really captivated by the mythology of ancient Egypt and this vast pantheon of gods with such unique traits and shape-shifting and idiosyncratic personalities. Like, I'm loving this, but maybe because I was viewing it through the eyes of my son, having got that book, it all seemed to strike me as the material for a good, fun fantasy, a way to just take all of that and exaggerate it into an imagined world. So that's where the idea for it came from. It's the only book, well, I guess, along with Pride of Carthage, that I can say there was like, a day that the idea came to me. So it took a little while to actually figure out how to write for a younger audience, because it's a new kind of skill set.
Yeah.
But that's where it came from. From there, it grew into a world that was both about gods and demons, but also was kind of riffing on solar power. Solar power and Ra was kind of so important to ancient Egyptian mythology, and in this case, it's become kind of a solar punk version of ancient Egypt, where that solar power is informing the technology.
I love that. I've seen it described as a solar punk fantasy novel. I mean, what could be more fun, Well, would you maybe share a bit with us?
I do have I have this opened up here. This is not going to be terribly solar punk, this part of it. The story itself ended up being that there is a young boy. He's raised in a village. He, in typical middle grade fashion, he's an orphan, or he believes himself to be. He was raised by a mentor who has taught him all sorts of things about kind of fighting demons and all these kind of skills and reading hieroglyphs and all this stuff that he's like, yeah, I'm not really sure what this is about. And because it's not really stuff that he can use in his village life. But on his 12th birthday, he gets the news that he was born on the same day as one of the princes of the empire of Egypt. And that allows him to have the opportunity, if he takes it, to go to the capital and compete with other kids who had the same birthday to become the shadow of that prince. And that means the prince's bodyguard, confidant, friend, advisor, and hopefully lifelong, companion of sorts, ally of sorts. And he chooses to go do that. But as far as he knows, it's actually a kind of a deadly set of tests that he has to go through in competition with a number of other kids. So this is from the first day of that testing, when he is just kind of getting a feel for what faces him. Chapter 12, it's called Demon, You May Feed Now. I stepped into the royal audience chamber. For the briefest moment, I saw them. The pharaoh, the falcon-headed god, the goddess with the sun disk headdress, the prince, and the other court officials. I should have been trembling in awe from my head right down to my toes. And I would have been. Really, I would have. I'd never been presented to royalty, to the rich and powerful, to gods even. For a poor villager like me, this should have been an incredible moment. Except for one thing, the cave demon. He stood in the center of the sparring ring. One glimpse was all I needed to know who he was, one of the 9 jackal-headed demons that feed on rottenness. No munching on antelope for this guy. Zebra, apparently not. He goes for rottenness. I was glad it wasn't a mutt, but still. Cave demons were the stuff of nightmares, monsters, creatures who'd been warped and twisted by the dark magic of evil sorcerers long ago. They were ancient, perhaps even immortal. According to Yazin, they weren't the brightest of creatures, but being smart wasn't what they were about. Being deadly, that's what they were into. The demon had a man's body up to the neck. He was strong and muscular, a bit hairier than most. His feet were massive. His toes sprouted curving yellow nails that scratched at the paving stones. No regular jackal had ever had a head as big as his. It was so heavy that he stood straining under the weight of it. His teeth were longer than a man's fingers. His long tongue lolled out of the side of his mouth. His red eyes pinned themselves to me. He had only one purpose on this occasion, to make me dead, rotten, and edible. Judging by the look of him, he was ready to get the job done. So, this is the final candidate. I realized the smooth, rich voice belonged to Pharaoh Nephiro. I dropped to my knees and bowed, hoping the demon wouldn't take advantage of the moment to bite me in two. It doesn't look like much, the Pharaoh continued. I fear he's too thin to survive fighting this demon. Set, I'm not pleased. Your choices have limited my son's chances of securing a shadow. Far too many candidates have perished. Set? Would that be Lord Set? I glanced up. A figure stood with his arms crossed, leaning against one of the entrance pillars. His body was that of a slim, gray-skinned man, but his head was that of, well, it was I can't say what it was. His head was long and pointy, like an anteater's. He wasn't an anteater, though. He also looked a bit like a striped okapi, and he had two knobs on his head, similar to a giraffe's. He was a bit of all these animals, but he wasn't completely any of them. Weird-looking as he was, he radiated power. It was like waves of heat rippled in the air around him. He was a god, all right. Truth was, I'd never quite been able to make sense of the gods. There are hundreds of them. They're immortal. They each have distinct powers all their own. Many of them can change into other shapes at will. They know things that no human could ever understand, but they can be just as silly as two kids fighting over who gets to eat the last honey-dipped cricket. They are to be worshipped, and yet they also have to serve humankind. Yasmin assured me it all made sense. I'd never quite bought it, though. The demons have been fiercer than I expected. Suspected, Set said, answering the Pharaoh. His voice made me feel like I had just stepped barefoot into something soft, warm, and sticky. If you had voyaged with me to the bowels of the deep caverns, you wished for this assignment. I did, yes. My point is only that in those dark, foul places, all the demons seem horrific. It's difficult to compare one with another. He glanced at me. His gaze was a hot touch that brushed across my skin. In any event, we wouldn't want an unworthy shadow for the prince, would we? It might be demons such as these that the shadow needs to defend the prince against someday. The Pharaoh sighed. All right, let's see what he can do. Young man, this has been a very trying day. It's my hope that you will not perish in the next few moments. If you do, I'll be truly saddened. But we have traditions to uphold. He raised his voice and pronounced, Demon, you may feed now. And then they fight.
Thank you. How cool. Yay.
Thank you. Very kind. And, you know, all that stuff about the description of Set and, you know, are, from a modern standpoint, we don't know really what he was. Perhaps the ancient Egyptians, you know, could have defined exactly what he symbolized, but kind of was, you know, enjoying riffing on stuff like that. But everything about his description, that's actually, yeah, in the historical record.
Cool. Wow, interesting. I didn't know that. Christopher, where would you like to go from here? I could, of course, keep asking questions all day long, but...
Well, I guess one thing I'm really curious about, and especially because I know you through, entering the program, and you primarily through your genre work, and I know that you teach at genre-friendly programs, and so but looking at your back catalog, you've got kind of like a set of like literary and historical novels, and then the move into fantasy. So I'm kind of curious about your journey, because you mentioned DMing like early on and having that love and inspiration there. And then I guess maybe if you could walk us through how that your re-embrace of fantasy, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So, although I fell in love with reading and ultimately literature in general as a kid who began reading fantasy, I think there are a lot of us out there.
I was one of those, for sure.
When I headed into college, undergrad and grad school, Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, I was very much focused on world literature and even that kind of literary style, and that's what I focused on. It's all I read during my MFA program. and never had any notion that I would write in the genres. And I came out of that program with 2 novels that I thought were great, studies of a little bit, some autobiographical stuff. They were kind of coming of age, African-American male stories. And they were very much processing some of my issues and also exaggerating them as well. I had an agent for those, and I was like, okay, you can go sell them. I'm going to go overseas and hang out and wait for the call. I did go overseas and hang out. I went to the UK. I had a visa to work there, kind of a student exchange thing, although I wasn't a student, but as a recent student, for 6 months. And I thought my agent will sell one of these books, and I'll go home, as a victorious writer, a published writer. So that part of it didn't happen. I instead, got the joy of rejections. Nice. But on the other hand, I did meet my wife, which was super awesome. That's when I went up to Scotland and was working as a bartender in the Edinburgh Festival Theatre, and she worked there as well. And next thing you know, we were together. And okay, this is kind of long-winded, but is this answering your story? I'm answering your question. It's part of my story. And when I first met her parents, so we left Edinburgh, and I went up to meet her parents in the countryside in Perthshire. It's just a lovely cottage, all by kind of by itself, totally picturesque and kind of amazing. And they were super nice, and they brought me in, and they had a nice conversation. And they're going to go make dinner. So they gave me a glass of wine, deposited me in the study. Go relax. So I did. I went in, and there was a nice coal fire, because that's the way they roll there. Yeah. Still, and there was a bookshelf along one wall, just floor to ceiling, amazing bookshelf. And I remember scanning through it and having my mind blown a little bit. This will seem silly, I guess, but on this bookshelf, you could have Nobel Prize winning authors next to Terry Pratchett, comedic fantasy next to crime novels, next to stories for kids. It was all there together, and I hadn't seen a bookshelf that was so diverse. Like, I attended to, in my literary, maybe a certain amount of arrogance, thought I could only have a certain type of book on my bookshelf. And these folks, who were cultured and kind of amazing, generous, well-read Europeans, they were like, it's all stories, and it's all stuff that informs who they are, who their kids are, and that planted. I totally remember that moment, whereas like these can all be there together. But I wasn't quite there yet in making that shift myself. Go forward a few years, my wife and I, we were married, coming off a year of raft guiding in California, and we went to France to live for 6 months, where she had a job with her sister at a ski company, and she had just become pregnant. So she said, I'm going to support you for 6 months, and you need to write a book that's going to get published. Stop revising those first 2 and write something new. And when I began doing that, it's the novel that became Gabriel's story. That was written in France. And it's a black Western, essentially. It's about a black homesteading family and the boy who is really disgruntled with this move out to Kansas and runs away. And lots of stuff happens to him. That novel, as I was reading it, I began reading Westerns, because I was looking to write a literary Western, but I needed some Western material. So I was reading some Elmore Leonard, and again, it's just a collection of moments where I remember exactly when I had this feeling, coming to the end of one of his books, where he had gotten the character into such a horrible situation. There's no way out. But it was so satisfying when the character finds the way out, because all those ingredients were there all along, and he just needed to put them together. And I was like, wow, that's how you do that. I want to do stuff like that too. And that actually, in became a part of the book, part of the climax of my book. It was a similar sort of revelation. And that was just a moment where I went, you know what? These folks who write in genres, they might have something to teach me. So I'm going to start reading more widely than I was before. But that was a big part of it. And then, so then I go a couple of African-American historical novels and the novel about Pride of Carthage, Hannibal. And then after that, I was wondering where to go next. And I read Dune. I listened to the audiobook of Dune, and that was a revelation. I was like, wait a minute, this is a really intelligent novel. It's complex, and it's taking me to this entirely different world in a way that was working for my adult brain. Like I am so into this. So that I kind of went, you know what? I think if I can write one more book, before I die, I probably need to acknowledge that everything as a writer began for me with fantasy. So that was kind of the impetus
for Acacia.
For Acacia. I wanted to bring to it a complex world and a very multicultural world, and the feeling of history, but also introduce and develop the magical and the fantastical in it as well. Yeah.
And Acacia is not just one book. You were thinking the one book before I die. Acacia is a series.
I'm still alive. Yes. Initially, the first book was meant to stand on its own. So if you wanted to read Acacia, you could read the first book and stop there. But the thing with epic fantasy is once you've gotten into it and developed this world, it's really hard not to want to continue. Really hard not to see where it could go after. So it became a trilogy. For a very brief moment, I said to my editor as I'm writing the third book that, actually, I need a fourth book. And he was like, no, just wrap it up, contain it. And that was the right decision, actually. It felt like I ended up being very proud that I wrote kind of the classic epic fantasy trilogy, whereas there are some writers, for example, Mr. Martin, George, they keep getting bigger and bigger, and they keep going. But yeah, I think that's kind of, I wasn't writing for kids, but I was acknowledging the importance of the genre in my life.
Yeah. I'd love to go back to Gabriel's story just for a minute, because I think the concept of like a Black Western is so cool. And I think you might have a sample that you, maybe from that?
Well, it's a super short bit.
That's perfect. I mean, because I'd love to just share, what that voice is, and especially since we just heard Shadow Prince, which is maybe a bit of a younger sort of voice and tone. It'd be great to sort of explore Gabriel's story a little bit more.
Okay, great, thank you. Again, it's like a paragraph, basically, from the beginning of the novel. And so Gabriel and his family, I'll say this about this book. In some ways, the second novel that I wrote that went unpublished was the foundation of this.
Yeah.
The family dynamics, the fact that this boy's father has died, and a stepfather steps in, and he has a lot of issues with that stepfather. So that played out in Washington, D.C. of the 1980s in the first version. This version, it went to the 1870s and Kansas, and it became a very different book. Yeah. But he was not a happy lad to be taken out to Kansas. So this is the introduction to Gabriel. The boy had measured their progress across the land through the warped glass of the train's windows. He'd seen it all unfurl, from the tidewater up over the broken back of the mountains, out onto rolling hills and into the old frontier, now pacified and peopled and farmed, and further still, through the cities and small towns, and finally, out onto this great expanse, across which they traveled like fleas on a mammoth's back. He'd even watched at night, while his younger brother slept against his shoulder, and his mother contemplated thoughts of her own. He searched in the land's dark contours for things he dared not name aloud, and he held within himself a rage of voices that to the outside world looked and sounded like silence.
Nice, thank you.
He has issues.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. Turning to maybe Acacia for a little bit, and sort of that fantasy realm and world building. And Christopher, did you have anything you'd like to ask about maybe Acacia and that sort of part of the thing?
Well, yeah, I think what I'm curious about, just because I know you have really good insights about this, are in terms of your early inspirations. You mentioned. Is it the Bourdain Chronicles? Am I saying that correctly? Yeah, okay. And a lot of the fantasy is very white and Eurocentric, and you set out to make something that like a fantasy trilogy that better reflects the diversity and how multicultural our world is. So I'm curious about your approach with that. Maybe things that you set out to do or wanted to be really intentional about versus things you wanted to avoid, and also maybe how that worked on the publishing side of things.
Right. Yeah. So part of what I was thinking about doing an imagined world, it kind of went back to this thing I thought about. Okay, I'd like to write a novel that is kind of about the Mediterranean, but also is kind of about Africa and kind of about Asia and a little bit of New Zealand thrown in. And yes, it was kind of like all over the place. But if I was trying to do that as a regular historical novel, I wasn't sure how to put all those pieces, how to pull them together into one cohesive story. But with fantasy, I can take all of those, the things about those different cultures that inspire me, and move them around and put them together in a way that I couldn't if I was being completely historical. So that was part of the inspiration. So when I read The Hobbit, I don't know who gave me this book, I don't know why it was in my hands, but my father's from Trinidad, and he split from my mother when they were quite young, but I used to go and spend summers in Trinidad. Trinidad and Tobago islands off the coast of Venezuela, right on the equator. It's very much a black and brown country, very tropical. So I have this book about the Hobbit in Middle-earth, and I'm reading that on the back deck, and outside I'm in a world where there's no one in the world around me that's in this book. But I was fully transported, and I think one day I read 30 pages in a day, and that was a big accomplishment for young David. And then I read 40 pages the next day, and then it was like 80 pages after that, and I was just so into that world. I found that amazing, and so I owe a lot to that novel. But as I thought about writing my own fantasy, I did want to include people that look not only like me, but like a diversity of our world. So that became important, and instead of centering it in Northern Europe, I just kind of drew it down a little bit to more like Northern Africa as the starting point, and filled a world around that. Yeah, and at the time, when you ask about publishing, there wasn't that much of that happening. George did create a world that where there are all these places on the map and in outside of Westeros that reflect that reality, but it was centered in Westeros, and I was changing that. And I was fortunate enough that my publisher, Doubleday, they were my publisher for my first 7 books. They went with me on that, and it was actually well received. And I think that was a little bit before the fantasy and science fiction market was including very many authors of color, but in the years thereafter, it bloomed, and a lot of people were able to enter and to take fantasy into all these different places in the world and be inspired by all these different cultures, which I think has been amazing. I was part of the transition in that for that to happen.
You've mentioned George R.R. Martin several times, and I know you've worked on the Wild Card series, and I wonder if you might start by, for anybody who isn't familiar with that series, maybe talk about that a little bit, and then maybe we could explore for our students mentorship and that kind of thing in the context of that conversation a bit.
Right. So probably heard of George R.R. Martin and Game of Thrones. And everyone asks, because I know him, it always comes up, so, when's he going to finish Game of Thrones? And George has a lot of things that he does in his life that also matter to him. And he stays true to those things, including, his friendships and the people he chooses to bring into his inner circle, but also to something like Wildcards. It is a series of novels that has been around since 1987.
Yeah, I had no idea it was that long.
Well, they're dwarfed by Game of Thrones.
Right.
But and then anyone else's standard, we're 30 books in, it's a successful series. It's just not world conquering quite the same way. But it came out of gaming. He was a gamer, and they used to play these kind of role-playing games, and he began to have his writer friends put some of that kind of superhero and mutant history an altered event in our history that introduces a virus that kind of creates a certain number of superhero type powers, and lots of folks who, if they don't die, are changed in ways that are often grotesque, actually. So it's a mixture of that. It's it's not just about superheroes. It's about the folks who get changed, but maybe have a big burden on their lives because they're othered because of those changes. But his approach to doing it was that he was the editor, but that he would invite author friends in to be part of the consortium, and they would write their character, and there'd be a basic idea for what the book would be about, and then he'd invite folks to say to pitch for it. How would you enter that story? How would one of your characters interweave with the main storyline? So each book has maybe 5 or 6 writers working on it. I met him at kind of my first fantasy convention, World Fantasy. And do you want to hear the story of meeting? Do you want to hear the story of meeting?
Absolutely, yeah.
Of course, people want to hear that story.
So it was kind of right in the middle of the convention. There's this night. It's the big author signing night. I had just published Acacia, so I qualified as a fantasy author. And I was having dinner with friends, and they were talking about, okay, so this is the way it goes. You go into this big room, and there are all these tables set about, and you go and you pick up your name tag and find some place to sit. And then they said, thing is, you don't want to do something silly like sit next to George. Because, he's nice enough, that's fine, but it's going to kill your soul. He will have this enormous line of people there the whole time, as soon as the audience is, the general public is allowed in, and you, debut fantasy novelist, will probably just kind of wither and die. And that seemed like great advice initially, but the more I got to think about it, it's like, I have the advantage of not having very much ego and not expecting to have a ton of readers showing up there. And you know what? Maybe I should sit next to George if that is a possibility.
That's awesome.
I walked in, got my name tag, looked around, and sure enough, George was sitting in a table by himself. And he's very distinctive. He had the hat on, the beard. And I walked over and said, "Do you mind if I sit here?" And he kind of, looked at me a little funny and said, "Sure, sit down." So we had about an hour and a half or so before, well, I think it was about that. Let's say we had an hour or so before the full audience came in. So we just talked and got along well. When the doors opened and people rushed to him, and yes, he did have an enormous line of folks waiting for a signature, I was there to move books around for him and open pages. I was kind of like an assistant for his signing. Every now and then someone came to me, but mostly it was dealing with his stuff. By the time that was over, he was asking to read Pride of Carthage, actually, is what he wanted to read, because he's a big historical fiction fan. And I sent him that, and that's kind of how our friendship began. He wrote me an email kind of saying, there's this wildcard series, do you know anything about that? would you be interested in writing for it? I did know something about it and said, yes, absolutely, I'd be interested in writing for it. And then he says, okay, what you need to do is create a character, your first character to enter the series, and once I approve it, I'll let the other folks know, and I'll introduce you as joining the group. I was like, okay, great. But at that point in time, there were maybe 22 books or so there'd been a lot of characters. And it was really hard to come up with one that I'd propose that George wouldn't say, yeah, we've done that like 3 times. Or yeah, that's a really stupid idea. What about something else? That just kind of went on for a while. And this is, again, I get a bit long-winded with these, but it's, the way this played out was that I was having another one of those emails I got where he'd shot down my characters. I was like, this is getting bad. Maybe this is going to work. But my son was sitting beside me on the couch, and as if he knew all along, I guess, he had this binder that friends had given him that was Sage's big book of superheroes and mutants. And in it were all these character sheets. So he had created all these characters, superheroes and mutants. There's a part where he drew a picture, and then there was like, what's his origin story, what's their, who's their nemesis, and what are their powers. And I was like, let me see that, Sage. And actually, the first character that George finally approved was a character who first existed in Sage's big binder.
That's awesome.
It was kind of his character, kind of my character. George had some influence in building it, and that was the one that began my writing for Wildcards.
No.
And it got on the cover of the second book that I wrote in.
Because you've been in 4, and then a 5th is upcoming, or
yeah, that's right.
So, of the Wildcards.
Yes.
And is that same character threaded through?
The first 3, it was kind of a cycle of books. That's the thing. People go like, how do you start reading Wildcards? There's so many books. And some of them are standalone ventures. You could just read that book. And sometimes there's a cycle. So I ended at the beginning of a cycle of 3 books. And that character, IBT, the infamous Black Tongue, was a character throughout all 3 of those. And he's gone on to be in books that other folks have written, and they've included him. Because that's the other part of it. The collaborative aspect is that we're creating characters, but we're also using and working with other people's characters as well, which means you have to run things by them. If you're going to do something to a character that's been around for a while, you have to make sure the author is okay with that.
That's such a cool concept.
I killed a major character in the second book, and I pitched the idea to George, and he's like, well, that's a great idea, but this guy has been in the series since the start. You'll have to talk to the author and verify that he's okay with that. So I wrote a very carefully worded letter about how I was going to kill his character and what he thought about that. He was okay with it. So that's
because it doesn't mean that he can't write more. It's just not this character.
Yes. He kind of went, if he's going to die at some point, that's a pretty good way for him to go.
Oh, that's awesome.
That was fun.
So if you had to recommend, if people are probably saying, okay, well, I kind of want to get into Wildcards, what would you recommend?
Okay. Two ideas. One is to start with the first book. It begins essentially kind of around the 1940s, and when the virus is introduced, and then it moves through decades after that. So that is a really great introduction to the series overall. The more self-serving suggestion is to begin with the novel Fort Freak. That's the one that my character first entered in, and it's kind of a police procedural. That's another thing, that the style and the aesthetic of the books varies from book to book. So in that case, it was a police procedural. The next book had some, my scenes kind of had a bit of a Spartacus gladiator aspect to it. And the third book is kind of a Lovecraftian horror in that cycle. And that's a good place to start.
Cool.
But I will say I have another reason for that, and this. let's just say that there is a TV series about it in the works. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it's been through a few false starts with a number of networks, but it's still in the works. And if that goes, I'm glad to say it's going to include some of my characters.
Oh, cool.
So that's another reason Fort Freak might be a good place to
Fort
start.
Freak, okay. And I should say that we have several of your titles available here today. If you're interested in getting into some of them and getting signed copies, you're more than welcome. We'll also be on the radio at 3 p.m. We didn't even get into the TV stuff yet, but as a last question, I always like to ask, we have a combination of students and faculty and community members, but for our students in the audience, what advice do you have? What is the one thing that you maybe wish you had known or wish you had done when you were a college student? Oh, I stumped you with that one.
Yeah. Interesting. I kind of like the things that I did.
Well, what were they? I mean, like, it's sort of as advice type. Is it, what made your experience so satisfying?
I feel like in college for me, it's kind of planted all the seeds for the creative person I became thereafter. So I had this love of history and thought I was going to be a history major. I was a history major for a while, but I learned that while I loved history and found so much inspiration studying history, that I was really kind of a storyteller, and that my brain was not a historian's brain in terms of focusing in on one time period, one kind of focus, and knowing everything about that. It's like I wanted to be that person, but it's like, okay, that's not me. Instead, I'm a person who can temporarily fall in love with a time period and a character and a story, and then I'm going to write about it. So it was kind of, if I did anything right early on, it was figuring out that the things that interested me were going to inform my future, but the path of that future was not necessarily what I thought it might be. So it was a combination of finding the things that I loved, and then finding how I could love those things going forward.
Right.
And for me, that was as a storyteller, but with that inspiration of history.
Yeah, that's great advice. Find what you love, but yet kind of keep the path
your way
open.
Your way of going forward with that.
Thank you for that. You did it. Yeah.
Just do the things David did.
Yeah, do the things.
Did a lot of silly things.
Maybe not everything.
But mostly they kind of worked out. I traveled a lot, spent my time in Whitewater. That was a big, and people would ask, when are you going to write about all this outdoor stuff that you do? And again, it's like, okay, well, I think I'm not going to write a whitewater kayaking novel. But on the other hand, if you read my works, a number of the books have whitewater scenes in them. They're just in very different guises. Like in Gabriel's story, there's a whitewater horseback riding scene, for example, and there's a big whitewater scene in Acacia, actually, too. So anyway, again, those experiences were so important to me, but I find a small way to incorporate those into what is otherwise my life work and career. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Christopher, for sharing the stage with us and having such thoughtful, insightful questions. And David, thank you so much for your time. It's been so great to get into your work and your process. We're going to continue that if anybody would like to, again, get a book and on the radio later today. But otherwise, that's all the time we have this week. So thank you both. And thank you, everyone. See you next time.